from the Minimal Intelligence Lab in the University of Murcia, and he's going to be talking on the possibility of plant sentience.
Don't applaud quite yet, okay? You might regret it, right? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess he was kind enough not to say it. I will say it myself. I guess I regard myself as the crackpot that thinks that plants think, right? And on top of that, I have the feeling that plants can feel as well, right? So that's a bit of an issue. We can just, I would say, I will ask you to, in this peaceful setting we are in, to be indulgent on me and assume with me, for the sake of the argument, a tiny, harmless, highly probable hypothesis, right? Such as that one stated long ago. But basically, I would like you to consider the possibility that where there is life, there is mind, right? In fact, it's even worse. I will ask you to consider more specifically, and according to the cellular basis of consciousness hypothesis, that subjective awareness is a fundamental property of cellular life, right? At least according to some people like Arthur Weber in the First Minds, and that all forms of sentience and consciousness evolve from this original instantiation in prokaryotes, right? So if you are with me, we are with them. These guys here, okay, are already bringing some form of mentality to the picture, right? If that's the case, then we are all set. We shouldn't have any problem, right? I mean, if there is one lesson we learned from Darwin long ago, is that there is no subordination, there is no relation of subordination in between the different guys within eukaryota, right? As you well know, some guys got these plastids that allow them to cook up their own food. They don't need to go shopping. They do their own stuff with sunlight. And, it's not their fault that these other guys have to go shopping and do their, think hard about the dish for the evening. But if we go back all the way to the last universal common ancestor, or the last eukaryotic common ancestor, we are on the same boat, right, as far as the life-mind equation goes. And yet, with that being said, it's tempting to assume that only organisms with flexible cell walls, okay, forget about plant rigid cell walls, a sensitivity to its surroundings, okay, there's a lot to say about that. Plants are much more sensitive than we think. And the capacity for locomotion will possess the biological foundations of mind and consciousness. Okay? Those guys will have that. Oh, the guys that locomote, we are in trouble, right? So that pretty much allows us to, even though we start that low in the tree of life, we get rid of these guys at some point. But how come plants are left out of the picture, despite what I just said? Well, there is a line of reasoning that goes like, being sentient, is demanding, is costly, metabolically speaking, right? You need some sort of mechanisms for processing all these huge amounts of information. Then you need to somehow control the guidance of movement, some way of controlling the way you navigate your surroundings and everything. And you've got, of course, to have the ability to monitor both the internal states and the environment, and to orchestrate all that stuff in an efficient manner, right? So, plant might have said, well, I can't be bothered to do all that. I'll get rid of, this basic awareness, no locomotion, no flexible cell walls, no sensitivity as far as we zoocentric thinkers think they are, right? We think they are much less capable of that. So they might just get rid of this, right? So just consider the case of the ability to monitor all these things and orchestrate it all. Well, we know that plants respond adaptively to a wide range of stimuli, right? So to this end, plants transmit information in a number of ways. You know, you can think electrically, hydraulically, with chemical volatiles, reactive oxygen species compounds, and waves, calcium waves. I mean, you know, you name it. But there is a way in which there is some systemic signaling in plants, orchestrating the whole thing throughout the whole plant body, from root to shoot, right? That's how it goes. In fact, this is funny because, you know, forget about the details, fine-grained details aside, we might say, or we have the default understanding of this hardwire, one-to-one responses, plant-based responses, like, you know, gravity, the vector of gravity, and then we think, okay, they just go down. Okay, roots, you know, go downwards to the center of the earth. Shoots upwards. So a negative geotropism or a positive geotropism, and that's it, pretty much it. So that's very automatic, very hardwired. You don't need to think about it a lot, right? And what happens instead is that they've got to integrate all these incoming signals. We just need to be careful when we make these observations. So for example, if you allow a root to grow upwards, if you turn it upside down in this tube, and there is not enough room to perform a U-turn, the root will just grow upwards, right? And then you might say, well, yeah, what's the deal? I mean, you just told us that you are not allowing it to perform a U-turn because it's constrained by the physical walls of the tube. But if you shine it with a white light from the top, roots are photophobic. They will thin themselves in order to have enough room to do the U-turn and escape from light, right? So if you watch this, that's what you see here happening, right? So they grow upwards, and then when they feel it, they say, hey, let's get the hell out of here. So things are much more complicated, and we'll get to this soon because we need to understand exactly what's going on. The cartoon version is that, you know, you have these statocytes, they sediment at the bottom of the cell. So you have these intracellular organelles, they are sedimenting and boom, signaling where downwards is, right? But when you are stuck upwards, there is no shaking, no sedimentation, so what's going on actually? There is the need to integrate all these incoming signals and provide a global response which is adaptive, right? So no hardwire, no one-to-one. As far as the internal mechanisms go, you know, if you think of these human systems, if you think about it physiologically for the time being, then there's not such a big deal, of course. I mean, we all know that we have the perfect comparison, right, table. So if you think of the gas exchanges in the respiratory system, of course, the same goes with stomata, allowing for this in the leaves of plants. If you think of the digestive system and the uptake of water and nutrients, well, that's of course taking place. If you think of the circulatory system for the transport of those nutrients, you have the vascular system of plants, you know, pumping nutrients and water all the way up through the xylem and sugars all the way down through the phloem. So the vascular system is providing all this motorway for the trucks to carry the goods, right? If you think of the nervous system and talk in terms of control and perception, well, that's pretty much what you get in plants once you understand how sensitive they actually are. And, of course, they didn't have flexible walls. They do have rigid walls, and that's their skeleton, right? So pretty much we can take that approach and think physiologically in parallel in between the two models, right? One thing that is missing in this picture is not to think strictly physiologically, right? So the problem is that we are understanding the vascular system, the vasculature of plants from a physiological perspective in which we just think, okay, what we just said, okay, just pump all this water and minerals up, get all these sugars down, okay, let's get all this business running for these metabolic needs that plants have, right? And we forget that we can put it in terms of information processing as well. So what matters from our cognitive science perspective, so if we are going to discuss plant cognition and plant sentience, is the vascular system as an information processing network, right? If you do so, then, well, you see, this is a picture from 1926, right? From J.C. Bose, The Nervous Mechanism of Plants, largely ignored, right? Well, this is the vascular system of a stem layer of papaya with 20 layers of deeply interconnected CH tubes elements, right? It's a really complex structure, brain-like structure, and you can see that electrical potentials are being transmitting along all this highly cross-linked network, right? With anastomosis providing the horizontal connections. So it's a really intricate system for the sake of information transmission, okay? So that's a whole different picture that we have in mind once we approach it from this side. Now, this is what we do at MintLab. These are the booths that we use to time-lapse plants. This coxswain approach to plant life allows us, well, for one thing, we do record electrical activity. So we do phytoacupuncture. Something mentioned acupuncture. That's phytoacupuncture. So we stick needles, acupuncture needles, electrodes, and then we do the measurements. And we can check the electrical activity running throughout the vascular system and correlate it with the overt behavioral responses that you can see when you time-lapse them, right? We usually do like a picture every 5-10 minutes. We do a picture every minute, have as much data as possible. And you see this guy, that's the overt behavior. I didn't use the word locomotion. We talk about circumnutation, but basically the idea is the same. They need to deal with contingencies out there. And, you know, this is a climber. How is it not going to care about the support to climb onto, you know? You might think, well, you know, just those climbers that eventually bumped onto supports are the ones that pass their genes. Okay, no big deal, right? Well, I like to think that they are actually endogenously controlling the approaching maneuver to the pole, right? So they are prescribing the pattern of growth. So when we say that plants don't move, you just have to think in terms of growth and development. It's phenotypic plasticity, the name of their game, not ours. We go shopping, we waste our time, they don't, they do other things. And that's what they do. They circumnutate around, in this case the climbers, and search for the support. Search for the support. That's the working hypothesis, not simply bump onto the support, right? So now if you have this understanding, well, there's a lot of things you can think of. Well, in fact, we'll know with your talk later, right? Habituation and associative learning. I mean, one great example is habituation in Mimosa pudica. You know, you keep dropping the plant, and the plant gets it. Say, hey, I'm not going to fold my leaves anymore. This bloody experimenter is, you know, driving me crazy, but that's it. Well, that's pretty much what we think animals do, right? And they withdraw it, they stop it, they habituate, and there is no such a big deal. It's only a big deal because it's a plant subject. So that's our zoocentric prejudice, right? So if we remove those biases and those prejudices, we are much freer to explore, right? But this is pretty much the same thing. It's habituation in a plant subject. Actually, you can even think of Pavlov's dog. And what's food for plants? Food for plants is blue light. So we can have learning by association in plants. In this case, it's not Pavlov's dog, but Pavlov's pea plant. So this is a pea plant that ends up, after associating the condition and unconditioned stimuli, ends up getting excited about the fang, which was something that didn't, you know, do anything like the bell, after expecting that with the fang will come the food, that is the blue light, right? So this is, you know, this is not habituation. This is, I would say, a little bit more sophisticated, right? The plant has got to say, hey, here comes the blue light next. I'll get ready for my meal, right? So, yeah, you know, I think at least we should, you know, consider this, give them a chance, at least, avoid thinking so centrically. The guidance of movement is a whole different thing. I mean, this is just insane. I'm sorry I said insane because now comes the philosopher of neuroscience that I like to quote on this, which is Patricia Churchland. And Patricia went like, plants can't afford to be stupid. Being rooted, being there, just taking life as it comes, they can't afford to be stupid. But we have to be there running, predating, fleeing. No, we cannot afford to be stupid. They can't afford to be stupid, right? I said, what? I beg your pardon? How you mean? You mean it's the other way around, right? You mean to say that how smart they've got to be to pass down their genes despite being rooted, right? You see? Your opponents are mitolens and all these things, all these games. And in fact, what we have is, is again all this biased understanding of what movement, mobility is about, right? So we have a deeply rooted zoocentric understanding of mobility, and we have, on top of that, an information processing understanding of sentience and intelligence. And these two come together, and these two we have to fight against them if we are going to be able to appreciate plant life and sentience, right? So mobility is not what we think it is. Information transmission need not be information processing. I won't say anything about playing chess with sunflowers. The good news, though, is that there is no need to privilege our heterotrophic lifestyle. But we can ask ourselves, why information processing in the first place? Why information processing? Couldn't we apply ecological psychology principles to all kingdoms, to the actual 96 phyla in the whole 5 kingdoms? Literally, I mean. Now we are with Gund in the first slide. Let's take it seriously from the bottom up and not leaving anyone out, How can you do it? Getting rid of the very framework we are starting with. Let's try ecological psychology principles and not information processing principles on our subjects. What does it mean? For one thing, we remove the need to have an organism-centered understanding of information processing. So it's not about the organism itself, it's not what's inside the head, it's what the head is inside of, right? So let's think about the relation in between the organism and the environment and the coupling itself. Whatever is valuable is in the coupling itself. It's not something going on intracranially, right? So if plants don't have neurons, don't worry about that, because we are not worried about intracranial happenings in themselves. We are worried about them insofar as they are coupling and the system is picking up information from the environment and detecting information ecologically, right? And that's something we all do. The climber was doing that in the very same way that the animals do it. They move around, they navigate their surroundings, they circumnutate, they have to do something, they cope with uncertainty, cope with contingencies by picking up information out there, right? So if we apply the framework to all these guys, then we have a different view. Now, it's not just to think that we are being so centric about the notion of mobility. It's even worse, because movement does create a flow, right? So by moving around, I'm creating all sorts of flow. Optic flow is the paradigm, the canonical example, but you all know that I'm creating plenty of flows just by moving around, right? And this flow is providing information which is guiding in turn further movement. The only thing we don't need to buy that doesn't come in this packet is the idea that the flows got to be generated by the organism. No, that's the idea. Doesn't need to. Many times it is, but it doesn't need to. Remember the metabolic cost, right? So if that is the case, just think of this, a classical ecological room, Dave Lee's swinging room from the 70s in Edinburgh. You have a floor that remains stationary, and the room and the ceiling are swinging, right? The walls are swinging towards or away from the infant, right? And here, you can see what's happening. So you can see that the infant is going to sway backward and forward to compensate for the swinging of the walls. That's top technology from the 70s. It's pretty ecological. It's really good. Actually, Dave Lee, still emeritus in Edinburgh, was complaining a lot these last few years about the psychology building. Now they said, look, these things were being shot in the main hall of the psychology building in Edinburgh. And now, if you approach, you lean on the balcony, all you see is terminals with people checking their email. So they don't jump, they don't move around, they don't interact with their environment anymore. Right? In those days, it was just like a circus. Things were going on all over the place because cognition is about movement. If plants didn't move, I would agree that plants couldn't be intelligent. Okay? So the effort comes with understanding plant movement, plants' form of movement. And I'm even saying it wrong, not plants' form of movement, but the coupling, organism, environment. The unit of analysis is the whole lot. So it's not the observer doing the movement. The flow, in this case, is actually being created by the swinging of the walls, not by the movement of the infant, okay? So if you think in those terms, then it's easier to put ourselves in the shoes of plants. Now, this is a climber, you'll see it next, and this is your retina. And of course, when you are approaching an object, a target, you know what's happening. You know there is all these patterns of expansion and contraction. And then we care, ecologically speaking, about the relative rate of change in your retina, in the image. As I'm approaching someone, his image is becoming bigger in my retina. As I'm moving away, it's contracting. And if I rely on those relative rates of change, it's always relational properties. It's the flow what counts, the temporal flow what counts, right? You don't rely on snapshots. If you rely on the flow itself, then that's providing ecological valuable information for you to know how to deal with the surroundings. For example, shaking hands, then this is something we accomplished successfully because of that ecological information taking place, right? Now, check this out. This is what plants are able to do if we apply this ecological perspective to their patterns of circumnutation. I want you to focus, just forget about the lateral view, okay? You don't need to worry about this now. Just look here at the zenithal, at the top view, right? So here you see the guy circumnutating anti-clockwise. Yes, they all circumnutate anti-clockwise. This species, I mean. Okay, there it goes. You see it's performing the whole 360 degrees trajectory, the circle, right? So it's doing the whole lot. Now you'll see it gets bigger. Of course, it wants to reach the pole and won't locomote like the cactus before. It will just elongate and grow. And the bending zone before the tendril is allowing the plant to, okay, do this pattern of growth. And hopefully, if it's goal-oriented, then it will successfully reach its target. Now watch what happens. Up to a point, it will skip the second half of the circle and go for it straight. So it will cut across the second half and say, hey, I know now where you are. I saw you. Now I'm just going for you. Just watch next. One more, you see, again, one more round of circling around. Now watch. Goes to the back and shut. Look. It's so effortfully trying to grab. You see? I mean, it's yeah. Okay. So, I mean, was it's pretty cool. So, I mean, what did we say before about metabolic cost? Yeah, that was painful, right? Well, but now what's going to happen? It will go up there, get its fruits, and do all its evolutionary business. Well, well done, well done. Now, you know what? I cannot help but to think of plants as, in a sense, these locked-in syndrome patients that somehow cannot flag that they are mentally alive. Okay? Of course, I'm aware I'm using a metaphor here, but I cannot help but think in that way. And I'm trying this hunch to allow me to think of different experimental designs, to understand the way they flag that they are, because they do flag they are mentally alive. That's a working hypothesis. I just need to train my eye, which is what Darwin did. Darwin trained his eye. He was making this. I mean, to me, it's very easy. I do time lapse, which means I do the settings for the camera, pop, one picture every minute, I go and grab a beer. Back on Monday, 72 hours, that was 72 hours, by the way. Back on Monday, let's see what the plant did. Okay, Darwin was making these observations to the naked eye. And when you do it to the naked eye, then you are able to appreciate much more what they are doing. You are able to put yourself in their shoes in a different way. So it's a metaphor, but it's not a metaphor. Could we actually understand them if they flagged, if they said, hey, I'm here? Would we be able to perceive their message? This is like searching for extraterrestrial life. We might miss it, right, if we are not educated, if we don't train our eye, right? So we do need to be able to put ourselves in their shoes, right? Pretty much. I mean, that's very important to do. Once we do it, and we do it from an ecological, once we do it and we do it from an ecological perspective, then we can understand a lot of things. For example, we talk about relative rates of change, right? So relative rates of change, well, that's what happens with shade avoidance responses. I mean, plants respond to the ratio of red to far red light, right? A low ratio means competition, and then I need to elongate to compete out my neighbors and do photosynthesis. If it's a high red to far red ratio, then they are happy, you know, they can just relax, chill out, right? So that's, you know, now we can understand it if we are not simply doing plant physiology, but ecological plant physiology or ecological psychology in plants, then we can think in a different way about those ratios, because it's the very same thing we were doing with the retinal rate of expansion and contraction, right? Think of the plant moving around, growing or shifting their pattern of circumnutation, how that bears upon the ratio going up or down. Okay? So, to understand, I mean, shade avoidance is not that different from obstacle avoidance, right? So if we want to, ecologically speaking, if we want to understand obstacle avoidance, then we can put ourselves in their shoes by extrapolating or extrapolate by exploiting this interspecies continuum, right? That's something we can do, exploit this continuum. Well, we know that some blind guys can, you know, rely on clicking noises and, you know, process information as is being bounced back from the surface of obstacles in the vicinity. You know, maybe it's, of course, it's easier to do it step by step, right? So maybe it's easier before we think about what it's like to be a bat. Maybe it's easier, what is it like to be this guy? It's kind of closer to us, right? But if we proceed step by step in an empirically informed way, okay, then we can actually get these guys, the maize roots, in that interspecies continuum, now that all phyla in the tree of life are playing the same game. Why? Well, for one thing, we know, we are starting to know something. I was going to say we know a lot, we know nothing. But we are starting to understand something, for example, about plant bioacoustics. So the root tips of these maize plants, they turn towards the sound, the source of underwater sound, right? So if they play this frequency, which corresponds to the frequency of below ground running water, they turn towards the source of the sound, right? And we know also that plants produce their own sounds. They make their clicking noises. So I'm not saying we need to force that working hypothesis. I'm saying that if we are open-minded enough to consider the possibility to test this hypothesis, right, then we shouldn't reject doing so on a priori grounds. In the very same way that we didn't do that with anemones, why would you do that with mimosa? So let's just treat them all as Darwin did. No relation of subordination, right? So that's the idea. In fact, well, you know, Thomas Nagel asked some years ago, can we imagine what is it like to possess the much more refined sonar of a bat, right? And then we know a trick to proceed step by step. But in fact, bats are not blind. We are obsessed with echolocation, right? Ecologically speaking, we shouldn't focus on one sensory modality, on one channel, because we want to understand the global response, the global adaptive response that has to do with the orchestration of all the information. And here I mean stereoception, proprioception, interoception. It all comes together. And then, unless we talk of that orchestration and integration, we cannot bridge to sentience, right? If there is a priority of responsive plants, it has to do with that integration and that global response, not simply the hardwired response that we thought they were performing by following the gravity vector. Now we know they don't, right? So, bats are not blind. Well, we could try hard and imagine what is it like to possess plant vision, okay? And now, I don't mean it metaphorically, we are doing this, right? So, this is the cross-section of a typical leaf. You know, you see the cuticle, the epidermis, and the mesophyll. And these areas, functionally speaking, correspond to the cornea, the lens, and the retina, right? So here you have the chloroplasts, the ones they got that we didn't. Well, you know, these chloroplasts, they move around, in fact. You know, they move to the center of the dome, intracellularly speaking, to optimize sunlight intake. They move to the periphery when it's far too bright, and they need to, you know, to put the blinders, no, in the window. So they move within the cell, and that's not different from the retinal rate of expansion we were talking about. Blades are moving, putting themselves orienting towards the sun, or orthogonal or laterally, so that they are optimizing sun intake depending on the time of the day and the competition, the local competition. You can time lapse guys in the forest and you will see all the blades are doing their business, right? So it's not that crazy when you put it in those terms. And in fact, how much time I have left, Harold? Oh, are we over? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you should have told me. I'm sorry. I wasn't keeping an eye. So that's a pity because I have one. Well, this is plant vision, right? So I mean, this is an actual picture taken with the surface of a leaf. Of course, that was a journalist headlines, but we mean it literally, right? I mean, it's this is the Boquilla trifolio. I'm sorry, this is the Boquilla trifoliolata, and we just came back this spring from Chile, from the south of Chile, from this expedition where we went to hand these seeds. And what's fun about these seeds is that these guys, you see the T standing for tree and the V for vine. So this is the host tree, this is the vine, and the Boquilla, the vine, is mimicking the host. You see, this is the same one, but it's mimicking the host. And you look at this phenotypic plasticity, it's quite amazing. As they climb from one tree to the next, they change their phenotype to keep mimicking. This is quite astonishing. Now we have the seeds in Murcia, and then we are trying to have a bank of seeds and start doing, hopefully, experiments in the fall. But we are actually considering the possibility that they are exploiting some form of primitive form of vision, courtesy of Ocelli, of their primitive eyes. If you say, oh, you are crazy, Paco, you really are crazy. No, that's because this is the idea you have in mind. You shouldn't have that idea in mind. Once you remove that, then you can think of plants in this other way I was telling you. And because you still don't understand their language, but hopefully you will soon, I will thank you on their behalf.
Okay. Our next speaker is Chauncey Mayer from the Philosophy Department in Dickinson College, Carlisle. And he's going to be asking what forms of associative learning are plants capable of? And we'll have questions for the both talks after that.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. So like they said, I'm Chauncey Maher from Dickinson College, the Department of Philosophy, and I'm going to zero in on one bit that Paco mentioned in passing, which is associative learning. So the jumping off point for all of this is the research that he just mentioned from Monica Galliano and a few of her colleagues. They, a few years ago, just 2016, published a study showing that plants are capable of associative learning. And this is quite exciting simply because experimentalists had tried previously to show this and had not succeeded. So many who believed that plants were intelligent had sort of doubted that this could be done, could be successfully shown. So it's quite nice that they have good results showing this. It's not simply exciting for that reason. It's exciting for the reasons that bring this conference together, namely that it raises the question of whether plants have minds. There's other language you could use for raising that question. For instance, you can ask the question of whether plants are cognitive systems. You might ask the question of whether plants are conscious, whether plants think, whether plants are intelligent. And I like this question, are they cognitive systems? Do they have minds? In part because I'm committed to philosophy. I like these definitional sounding questions that seem eternal, seem profound. But there's something that's a bit disappointing in these questions, I think, after you do enough reading, enough research. So to the question, are plants cognitive systems? Some people say yes. Famously, Professor Calvo says yes. I have a little book saying yes. But there are others who say yes. Many intelligent people, and botanists, psychologists, philosophers, not just crazy people, some fairly responsible people who are trying to think very carefully through the issues. But the vast majority of people say no. The vast majority of people here being regular people, but also philosophers, cognitive scientists, botanists, biologists, neuroscientists, they tend to doubt in the extreme that this is worth anybody's time. There is a sticking point in this conversation when you ask whether plants are cognitive systems. And one way to formulate that sticking point is this question, what is a cognitive system? Again, there are variants of this question. What is a mind? What is consciousness? What is information? What is intelligence? And the philosopher tends to enjoy that kind of question, what is X? Tell me, give me an analysis, give me a definition. Of course, scientists famously appreciate this kind of question, defining your terms at the outset. But I think if you read the literature where one tries to define what a cognitive system is, what a mind is, you'll eventually realize that there's quite a bit of stalemate and intuition collision that makes you feel like progress is incredibly slow or is not likely to come anytime soon. So while on the one hand I believe that there are many great contributions to the literature on what is a cognitive system or what is cognition, I also think that it's worth pursuing other avenues rather than simply focusing on this question. And I do want to highlight there's a deep philosophical problem here that goes back at least to Plato. Sometimes it's known as the paradox of inquiry or the paradox of analysis. And it's simply the idea that any inquiry that we undertake of this form is going to be either pointless or impossible. It's going to be pointless if you inquire into what beauty is, and you basically in that search already have a preconception of what beauty is that will then confirm whatever comes up in the inquiry. It will be impossible if you don't already know what beauty is and go in search of it and continue to ask and ask and ask without some preconception in mind that will allow you to validate what beauty is. Another way in which there is a sticking point here is that it's just, as I said, a sociological issue. As a matter of fact, the informed people, the most informed people, tend not to agree on what cognition is, what a cognitive system is, what intelligence is, what consciousness is. It's a really tendentious kind of discussion. So, given the sticking point, what I would like to do is find some modest way forward. So, I'd like to pursue an alternative, and I'm using as my jumping off point an article, a remark in an article by the philosopher of mind and philosopher of science, Colin Allen, at the University of Pittsburgh, or now at University of Pittsburgh, previously at Indiana University. He says, let the productivity of research programs in cognitive science guide the extension of language to new contexts. This is in an article titled On Not Defining Cognition. So he's interested in not defining cognition as I am. What I'd like to do is, instead of asking what is a cognitive system in pursuit of the question whether plants are cognitive systems, I'd like to ask instead a version of what Colin Allen proposes, namely, can we extend psychological experimental paradigms to plants? In particular, what I'd like to do for the next 10, 15 minutes is articulate what this would look like in the case of plants, and in particular, what it would look like in the case of learning. So what I want to do is describe several learning paradigms that might extend to garden peas, the kinds of plants that Galliano and her colleagues focused on. So the kinds of classical conditioning that I'm going to talk about will be familiar to students of psychology in the room. You'll find them in any psychology textbook. They include latent inhibition, higher order conditioning, sensory preconditioning, devaluing the stimulus, blocking, and trace conditioning. Okay, Domgen, for instance, goes through all of these. They're standard. You can find them all over the internet. And they have been studied in a wide variety of animals, but have not been studied in plants. And I think basically one takeaway from what I'm saying today is that this is something that we should do. We should do these experiments. So I'm treading on lots of toes here. I'm the philosopher suggesting to the botanists that they should do what the psychologists are doing. So they're really going where I don't belong, which is, I guess, appropriate to a philosopher. So my question is, are plants capable of any of these? Let me say a little bit more about Galliano's experiment so you have a framework for understanding how I think we might extend what they've done. So here's some nice pictures of the garden peas, nothing so exciting as Professor Calvo's videos, but a nice illustration of the garden pea, a picture of the garden pea. This is the garden pea of famous Mendel experiments. What they rely on in these experiments is phototropism, which is simply an oriented or directional response to light. So plants do not simply grow in response to light, they grow in a direction given light. So there's negative phototropism and positive phototropism. Shoots tend to grow towards light, roots tend to grow away from it. Darwin and his son Francis experimented on plants and showed quite compellingly already in 1880 that it looks like light is detected in the apex of the shoot of any given plant, in their case, the canary seedling. Relying on the fact that plants in general, the flowering plants in particular, which are the vast majority of plants, are capable of phototropism, Galliano and her colleagues asked whether peas could grow towards a breeze instead, whether they could learn that. To do this, what they did was rely on, and here again is Professor Calvo's kind of diagram, on classical conditioning. So as we all know in Pavlov's experiments, dogs salivate naturally in response to the sight or smell of food, but they don't naturally salivate in response to the sound of a bell tone. And he was able to show that you could teach them to do that. You could teach them to take the tone of the bell as a sign that food is coming and make an association, as we say, between the two. And Galliano and her colleagues were wondering whether you could do this with a breeze or a fan and light. So their question is, roughly, can peas learn to associate the direction of a breeze with the direction of light? And as Professor Calvo said a moment ago, they did indeed show this. So just to give you a little bit more, what they were trying to do is show that with an unconditioned stimulus, light, and an unconditioned response, oriented growth towards that light, could we add in a conditioned stimulus, a breeze, a fan, and get a conditioned response, namely oriented growth towards that breeze? And indeed they did. They used this Y maze. There's two experiments here, the one at the top and the one on the bottom. On one side, they put the fan and the light in one experiment. In the other experiment, they put the light on one side and the fan in the other. in the first experiment in group 1, they trained the plants to associate light and breeze. They experienced light and breeze together, and then they tested them with the breeze alone. And a good bit more than 50% learned to grow towards the breeze alone. Okay. Again, this had not been shown previously, though people had tried. In the other batch of experiments that they did, they tested whether the light and breeze opposed each other in the Y maze and whether the plants would learn to grow towards the breeze alone, and indeed they did. That growing away from the direction of breeze will teach you where the light is. Okay. So they conclude from this that plants are capable of associative learning, and I think we ought to take that for granted, and it does raise this question of whether plants have mind or cognitive systems and so on. Now what I want to ask is whether plants are capable of other types of learning. So like I said, I'll go through 6 familiar types of these and explain how you might develop these experiments. Okay, so the first one is latent inhibition, but let me say a little bit about what's driving me here. Galliano and her colleagues themselves say that what they've done raises exciting opportunities for experimentalists in botany and indeed for psychologists and for philosophers at, say, the Minimal Intelligence Lab that Professor Calvo runs. Again, what I want to do is let the productivity of research programs in cognitive science guide the extension of language to new contexts. So with latent inhibition, roughly the question we're asking is whether the familiarity with the breeze will inhibit the learning. So if the plants are already familiar with breeze, if they get used to it, if indeed they kind of get sick of it, they've had enough of it, they won't tend to develop an association, or that's the hypothesis. So what you would do is produce the original experiment that Galliano did by exposing the 2 groups of peas to breeze alone. Then expose one group to breeze for a short period of time, say 3 days, and then expose another group, group B, to the light and the breeze together for a longer period of time. Okay? So you've got 2 groups. And then you run a test. You ask a question. Do more in the second group learn the association than in the first group, A? Right? If they do, that would suggest that peas must overcome some kind of prior expectation, in scare quotes here, for the breeze, because they have come to believe, think, again, in scare quotes, that the breeze means nothing. It doesn't correlate with anything. It is not associated with, for instance, a source of food or energy. Right? The idea that plants have expectations, of course, would be surprising, and maybe expectation, of course, is just mere metaphor here. We would need to pursue that further. A second type of conditioning that is widely studied in animals and displayed by many animals is higher order conditioning. You can think of this as chaining conditioning together, chaining associations together. So one way to express the question that you would have here is whether plants could transfer, peas could transfer what they've learned. Learn one thing about the breeze and the light and transfer something about that to another association, another contingent relationship in the environment. So do Galliano's experiment again, establish this association between the breeze and the light. Then, having established that association, which we should be able to duplicate, expose the peas to the breeze and some other neutral stimulus. This could be various things, so this is just a suggestion. It could be low temperature. It could be high temperature, it could be high humidity, it could be low humidity. It has to be something that the plants are responsive to, that they can detect in some sense, but don't have an innate response to. Right? And then again, run a test. What you would be asking is something like, do the peas grow toward temperature, to the low temperature alone? Okay? Can they move the association from breeze and light and then breeze and low temperature to light and low temperature? Can they make that connection? Okay? This has not been tested before in plants, and it would be worth checking. One thing that would be exciting about this, if they were able to do it, is that it would suggest that they can connect stimuli that they had not previously encountered before. That is, they could make a connection between the direction of light and the direction of a low temperature, and even though they had not experienced those 2 things together. And that would suggest that they are more flexible than we might have previously thought, that they can identify associations that are there by, say, what you might think of as inference, higher order conditioning. So greater behavioral flexibility. A third type of conditioning that is widely studied in animals but not yet pursued in plants is sensory preconditioning. And this is like higher order conditioning in that we're wondering whether peas can transfer what they've learned. So you would again do that initial experiment, expose the peas to the breeze and light together, or breeze and low temperature. So we've switched the order now. So breeze and low temperature together. You're trying to establish an association there, so picking a neutral stimulus like the low temperature. And now you would introduce Galiano's experiment. So you'd establish an association between breeze and light this time. Okay? So it's used to breeze and low temperature, and now you do Galiano's experiment. Breeze goes together with light, and now you're wondering whether light will go together with low temperature. So you'll ask the question, do peas grow toward low temperature alone? Again, if you could show this, the result would suggest that peas connect stimuli that they have not previously encountered together before. Again, it would suggest that they are capable of quite a bit of behavioral flexibility. A fourth type is devaluing the unconditioned stimulus. This is basically the kind of thing where you make the light uninteresting, unvaluable, needless to the plant. So when light is less appealing to the peas, will they tend not to grow towards the breeze? So the way to do this would be to establish an association, as they do in the original experiment, between the breeze and light. So they've got that connection in their head that breeze is a sign of light, that I should go towards the breeze if I want food. But then what you do is make light not valuable to them. You make them not want light. And there is a way to do that roughly. You could illuminate them to their light saturation point, which is just a technical phrase meaning that this is the point after which photosynthesis will not increase. It will plateau and probably tend to decrease. They won't need more light. They won't want more light. So having made light less appealing, will they find breeze less appealing? Right? So you ask that question. Are peas less responsive to the breeze at that point? If you're able to show this, this might be one of the more exciting things that you could find. It would suggest that the breeze does not directly control the oriented response, that breeze dictates the response or determines the response. It would suggest that the response is mediated by something, and now again, some richer vocabulary that, of course, will raise eyebrows. It suggests that the oriented response is mediated by a representation of light, that when it feels the breeze, experiences the breeze, encounters the breeze, is mechanically stimulated by the breeze, it's going through some process that simulates, well, this is light-like, but I don't need light, so I'm not going to grow towards it. Many people think this is a way of interpreting devaluing the unconditioned stimulus generally. Many people think that this is why cognitive psychologists need to use talk of representations when talking about animals. So if you could show it for plants, then you would be in the same boat with them. All right. The blocking effect, again, is also a fairly exciting kind of experiment, a fairly exciting kind of behavior that is shown in many animals. To do it with the peas, you might say something like this. Can one association block another from being formed? And this experiment is a little bit trickier than the other one. So what you do is establish an association, as in the original experiment, between the breeze and the light. Okay, so that's the original again. This time what you do is expose the peas to light and the breeze with low temperature. So there's that additional neutral stimulus. Okay? So there's already an association between breeze and light, and now you want to add in, or try to add in, an association between light, breeze, and low temperature. And the question is whether the peas will learn to associate light and low temperature, or whether it will be blocked. And often they find in animals that it will get blocked, that the animal does not notice, identify, recognize a connection between light and this second neutral stimulus. So the question would be, do peas learn to grow towards low temperature alone? So rather than saying if they do, let's say if they don't. So if they do not do that, if they don't learn to do that, peas have something like expectations. So the blocking effect, the blocking experiments done by Kamen raised this vocabulary of organisms having expectations in the particular sense that probably the organism, in this case the peas, don't learn the association because they already expected the light given the breeze. They were already expecting light to come given the breeze. So given breeze and low temperature, they're not now surprised to encounter light along with low temperature. You only learn, according to Kamen, if there is a surprising connection, a new connection between a neutral stimulus and a unconditioned stimulus. So that would suggest they have expectations and can be surprised, which, to offer a bad pun, would be surprising. Okay. Trace conditioning is the final type of conditioning that I want to mention today. Again, what we're wondering here is, can peas learn to rely simply on a trace in making a connection between two stimuli? This is different from the kind of experiment that Galiano and her colleagues did, which is delay conditioning. So during the training for this kind of experiment, what you want to do is stop the breeze before you initiate the light. So in Galiano's experiment, the breeze is going, it's before the light comes on, it keeps going when the light comes on, and then you stop both. So they're experienced together. Breeze and light occur for some period of time together. In Galiano's experiment, that's what they did. It's sometimes referred to as delay conditioning. In trace conditioning, you stop the breeze before the light starts. So they never experience breeze together with light. The breeze goes on, and then there's a gap, and then there's light. The thought is then, if they learn to make an association, they've got to be relying on something like a trace a trace of that earlier stimulus, the breeze. So the question we would ask is, do the peas still learn to grow towards the breeze despite there being a gap? And if they did this, as I suggest, this would mean that they're relying on something you might call a trace, but richer vocabulary would have it as a memory, a representation of the breeze in order to establish a connection between the breeze and the light. Okay? The richer vocabulary might not be warranted, but you would then have to pursue that. You would have to do further experiments to see what was the content of what it learned. This would suggest that while the breeze had happened, then there's a break. Somehow the plant was waiting for something to happen, something that was meaningful, such as the unconditioned stimulus of light, to make a connection with that breeze. Somehow it held it in place, and now really tendentiously held it in mind. Okay. This little bit of the talk is called the conclusion, but it's really not a conclusion. It's rather an unconclusion, just raising some questions and provoking you a little bit further in the way that Professor Calvo did so nicely just a little bit ago. So I started by saying that Galiano and her colleagues, I think, have shown convincingly that plants learn by association. That by itself, I think, is very exciting. Psychologists should take that seriously. Philosophers of mind should take that seriously. Neuroscientists should take it seriously. I think it raises a big question. This is one way of formulating the question. Do plants have minds, or are they cognitive systems? You could raise different versions of that. However you raise it, I do think it raises this sticking point. You will run into this sticking point. In this version of it, the question is, well, what is a cognitive system? Give me your definition. Plato and Socrates step on stage, and then we spend 3 millennia bickering over it. I like the bickering. I teach the bickering on a weekly basis. It's enjoyable. It's profound. But I'm also interested in other ways of trying to get the understanding we seem to be after in asking the big question, are plants cognitive systems? Why are you asking that question? So what I've tried to do is just make some suggestions about how you would pursue this alternative. Can we extend psychological experimental paradigms to peas? To provoke you, I offer just a little bit of an argument. So I'll call it the argument from fruits. There is a highly questionable premise in this argument that I have not argued for at all. It's the first one. Asking what is a cognitive system tends not to bear fruit. Right? Asking what a cognitive system is tends not to bear fruit. It's not fecund. It's not productive in the way that we might think. It's not productive in the way that philosophers have tended to think. And a way to support this would be a pessimistic induction from the past. We've talked about it. We've argued about it. We haven't settled on it. We're not going to settle on it. And it's not because we're epistemically faulty. It's just that there's something wrong with the question. The second premise I've tried to provide some support for here today. Asking what can plants do, specifically asking what sorts of associative learning are they capable of, does tend to bear fruit. It bears fruit in the sense that it offers you further experiments to do, further questions to ask, that provide you the kind of intellectual satisfaction that you were seeking in the first place. It allows you to make connections between plants and other organisms that were presumably partly at the root of you asking the question, what is a cognitive system, or are plants cognitive systems? You want to know whether plants are like us or like other animals, like fruit flies or dogs or bats. Right? And the conclusion, of course, then is instead of asking the first sort of question, ask the second sort of question. Don't ask the definitional question, ask the experimental question. What can the plants do? And devise those experiments. Okay, last bit. So I was guided by this remark from Colin Allen. He says, let the productivity of research programs in cognitive science guide the extension of language to new contexts. Don't worry too much about the definitional question. The editors of the volume, of the edition, the issue that he wrote this article for, describe him as proposing that this would alleviate the need for increased clarity in general definitions of cognition. Rather than simply assert that, I want to offer you that as a question. Does doing this, does pursuing this alternative alleviate that need for increased clarity in general definitions? Does it remove that sense that I just have to answer this question first or get to it sooner rather than later before I get the understanding that I was seeking? I think I've given you some reason today to think that it will alleviate that need, but I at least want you to contemplate that question. Consider it as worthy of our attention. So, thank you.
Okay, I forgot to say in my introduction of Chauncey May that he has a book, Plant Minds, aimed at a general audience on these themes that might be of interest. Okay, we officially have 15 minutes for questions, but maybe we could take 5 minutes or so into the lunch. Would anyone like to come up to the microphones and ask questions? Do you guys have microphones? Or? How does this work?
This one? Whichever.
Well, one of you want it?
That's somebody.
Okay. Okay, Stuart.
Yeah, hi. Thanks to Paco and Chauncey for two very interesting talks. Regarding learning and information processing, I don't know about the vascular system in plants, but I do know that plants have microtubules. And a lot of us think that microtubules process information and store memory and form memory. And also plants can be anesthetized. I just Googled on my phone and found an article in 2019 in Nature Communications from Lyon showing that microtubules in plant cells detect tension. If you pull the plant cell apart, it's detected by the microtubule and then it acts. And it would seem to me that you could do experiments inactivating the microtubules and see if that affects their cognitive function. There are many drugs that do that, or several drugs, and they're all plant alkaloids, but you could inactivate the microtubules without messing up anything else and see if they lose their cognitive function. Suggestion.
That seems right to me, and I think Franciszek Beluszka and several others who are cellular botanists are interested specifically in doing those kinds of experiments at the cellular level, showing that, as Professor Calvo was describing, the anatomy of plants isn't really so different from the anatomy of animals as one might think, because, for instance, it relies on microtubules.
Yeah, I don't know much about
and
them,
plasmodesmata as well, which allow the transmission between two cells with walls.
They have walls, so they don't need microtubules for structural support. They're there for something else.
That's right. Yeah.
Should we have a question from over here?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting talks, and Chauncey, this question's for you. So we've already seen in the past that amoeba seem to have some abilities to strategize and respond to conditioning and learn and intend and evaluate and develop habits and have expectations and maybe create memories too. So can you go as far as saying that they have a body-identified awareness? And if they have a body-identified awareness, isn't that really the same thing as an ego?
Yeah, I do like the idea that I like the idea that organisms, plants, and amoeba as well, in some sense have a perspective on the world. So if using the language of ego, I think is just another way of talking about it, that they have an orientation towards the world. In a much older vocabulary, they have an Umwelt. And I think that's at least a good way to try to extend the language of cognitive psychology towards other organisms, and try to find some way to do further experiments that accentuate that.
Thank you.
Okay, question here.
Question to Paco. Mangroves grow in salty water. At some point, they have to get rid of the salt, so they pump all the salt to just one leaf. It becomes yellow, it drops, and then they get rid of the salt. Is something known about the mechanism how to choose that one leaf?
Yeah, well, actually, there's not just one mechanism. I mean, you have many halophytes, so plants that end up loving salt, right? And some of them tolerate it, some of them get rid of it, some of them get it throughout the leaves and crystallizes, becoming harmless. So there are a number of different strategies, right, that they can actually try. And one thing which is important that, we speak of plants, and that's also very symptomatic. We speak of plant intelligence or sentience, and we don't do that with animals. We try to think of individual animals, species in themselves. So which one do you mean, right? So some of them might be more tolerant than others, and even within a species, different subspecies might try different tricks or have been able to adapt to different niches differently, right? But all in all, actually, we have some work, yet again, this predictive processing understanding of, in terms of expectations and on plants and tolerance to salt stress, right? And so basically the idea is, again, the same, that some might try to, to move away or update their expectations or do something in terms of reducing error with a combination of mechanisms, right?
Question over here.
First, thank you. This is an amazing topic. It's one of the reasons I'm here, just to understand. I think we cannot get you anyway in terms of a proper science of consciousness if we ignore everything that there is towards the evolutionary process. And I think we might reach in a stage in which we are understanding kind of how is that the nervous system itself developed from all these individuals, like the plants you were saying, but from microbes to us. And there's a book, which is, I think, a very famous one, which is called Secret Life of Plants or Secret Life of Trees, in which they comment a lot about how many connectivities do you find in the roots of the plants, and you could compare it to a brain in somehow in terms of how this amount of connectivity. So I would like you guys to comment a little bit on it.
I was having a hard time to understand. Were you talking about mycorrhiza networks?
Yeah, I mean, like the root itself and the amount of connections that they have with fungi and everything, which could be similar to our brain network itself. Could you comment a little bit on this? Have you heard about it?
Yeah. There is a lot to be said about that. I mean, we are asking far too many questions. We want to know what's happening there, if it's truly a symbiotic relation, right? We think it is, but we are not quite sure who is at the wheel, right? I have a problem with, with nowadays we are getting used to talking of holobionts, and we always by default say, hey, this guy is the host. And I think that's, again, symptomatic of now an approach in which we put more weight on the side of the plant in the forest as opposed to the fungi, right? So if it's a truly symbiotic relation, we are talking, well, maybe for those of you not familiar, we are talking about, like, for example, you have a giant tree that cannot make it to the canopy to reach out and do its own business with light. So mature trees are passing the nutrients throughout this interconnected network below ground, right? So it's feeding their youngsters until they are big enough to do their own business out there, right? So that's been tracked, physiologically speaking. That's, again, been tracked throughout the whole forest, all the work by Simard, and they know pretty well how this good wide web works. What we don't have is the Coxsci understanding of that. So, temporally speaking, who is at the wheel means, again, in terms of expectations, is the tree driving top-down the expectations, and the fungi is simply part of the bridging in between the two root apparatuses, or is just one more guy at the wheel? So that's all that I'm wondering from a Coxsci perspective, how we could actually test, which is, again, I like the stress he was putting on testing things and not just discussing the terminology, but how could actually think of making experimental designs and throw light up on this, right? But that's a great example of swarm intelligence, right?
Thank you.
It's the forest itself.
Question here.
Andre. It's Andre LeBlanc. Really enjoyed your talks, both your talks. I have two quick questions. Have you ever tried putting the plant in front of two equally appealing options, and where it has to make a choice, but they're equally appealing? And what I would be interested in, is seeing whether there's hesitation, whether there's trying one, the other, just unsure what to do. Maybe deliberation, like, evidence of deliberation. My second question is...
When the two targets are equally appealing?
Equally appealing, you put them in a difficult situation. They could be equally appealing or equally unappealing. But they have to make a choice, but it's not an obvious choice. And second question, in the experiment that you both talked about, where you had plants learning to move towards the breeze to get the light, but not all of them learned. So in one case, 62%, the other case, 69%, I think. So have you noticed, what's the difference between those that learned and those that didn't?
Okay, shall I? Yeah, thanks. The bad news is that we have a lot of problems, right? So the good news is that we report this research. The bad news is that, in a sense, we've got to start from scratch. So now we have a project we started last January, and we are actually running all this. We are trying all these forms of learning that he was talking about, both habituation and different forms of associative learning. And what we realized is that we really need to start from scratch, as in from scratch. And by this I mean that you can't imagine how much cautious we've got to be. We've got to be extra cautious with plants, because we knew so little, and then we were being so little careful about it that, for example, if you think of roots, all the observations of root behavior up until the last 20 years, we have to get rid of them because they were being done in plain light side. So it was convenient for the observer to check the roots, to have the lights on, but it happens to be the case that roots are photophobic. So now we have to do it with infrared. Now, there are so many different problems. You can't imagine, I mean, the pilots, I could be running pilots and, preliminary studies until I retire and not get to do the crucial one. Why? Because one thing which is interesting, we have to talk about that, is, for example, think of the peas, right? Actually, with Monica, we are now trying to do that. Because I was telling Monica, look, what you are doing with the peas, you are just checking which arm of the Y maze it went through, right? It grew to the A arm or to the B arm, right? But we need to time-lapse that, because it's not the actual one it's popping out of, but the pattern of growth itself. You need to observe how it's actually performing that directional growth. So we need to time-lapse it, so that then we run into all these technical problems about sticking the camera in the Y maze and blah, blah, blah. So that's one problem that we have. But the second problem is that even though we want to apply all these techniques from the animal literature, we cannot do it straightforwardly, for the simple reason that their form of movement is phenotypic plasticity in the form of development and growth. And this means that you cannot do trials. You cannot get the rat out of the maze and put the rat at the beginning for the second trial. So all you can do, or at least that's what we are trying to do, we are 3D printing Y mazes, chained Y mazes. So that because you cannot just get the root out and back again. So, okay, you do a choice in between A and B, but the root keeps growing. Then you do another choice in the second Y maze, then in the third Y maze. So you need to chain the bifurcations into one single Y maze for all those consecutive trials, right? But, so if that is a technical problem, the problem is deeper when we want to interpret it psychologically speaking, because it's not the same guy anymore. So when you were asking at your first question was about, can you present the guy two equally appealing options and see what they do? Well, first, that's not possible to do. You will never be able to show two equally appealing options because simply the light will bounce off the surface of those two targets differently. Second, because electromagnetic fields are different. Is it oriented towards north, east, south, west? So all these things, plants are amazingly sensitive to all these things. So in a sense, you cannot literally have two equally appealing options in actual and set it up that way. We do have differently appealing options, like famously, like the cuscuta, right? And then, okay, tomato, a wheat, and goes for the tomato, right? More juicy, right? Things like that. But what I'm trying to say is that there are far too many problems that we have, to give it a lot of thought before we can actually put it into a proper experimental set and say, hey, we are going to get clean data out of this. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, this is good.
Can I ask a very quick question? Do either of you have any thoughts on the possibility of plant suffering? Chelsea was talking about questions that are worth asking, and that seems like, whether or not it's a question we can make progress on, it seems like a very important ethical question that's, in that sense, worth asking. We could move on if not.
The quick thing to say is that the experiments on anesthetics and the operation of anesthetics was initially taken and continues to be taken as reason for thinking that there's something like nociceptors, there's something like pain receptors, that it's knocking out that kind of process. And so one thought is that if you could show that anatomically it's similar, that would imply that it's got to be, well, cognitively, mentally similar. There's got to be something pain-like for it. And quite clearly you can see that plants experience damage, but you want to make the move from mere damage to pain, and there's a question about how you would bridge that in the vocabulary. Yeah.
Okay, let's...
Just a tiny note. I want to complain publicly that my university doesn't force me to sign an ethical thing. Well, I time-lapse climbing beans, and then I trash them. I do compost. But they don't ask me all the questions they ask the guys working with Drosophila.
Good question. Okay, let's try and get through a couple more questions if we go a little bit over time. Over here.
Yes, Jonathan
Sure.
Schooler. Thank you. That was very stimulating. I'm wondering if you could speak some more about the way in which plants respond to psychoactive drugs. It seems like that would be an implication of them having some kind of consciousness. It was mentioned before that they respond to anesthesia. I've heard that plants, in some cases, show altruism to other plants. Does oxytocin affect them? Have they looked at the effect of psychedelics on plants, and so on?
Yeah, thanks. Point one is that it would be funny, it would be awkward to think that they are, developing all these adaptations. Now I'm thinking in terms of all these molecules and, pathways and things for our sake, right? So we are so anthropocentric that they go, oh, yo, how kind of you to do that stuff for me, right? So if evolutionarily speaking, if at that time they got all those molecules doing that stuff, that for sure wasn't for us, right? We need to think hard in terms of the ecological relations of coevolution, which again we are not doing, because when we think of patterns of coevolution, the pollinator is always the smart guy. And the plant is simply there with its sexual organs, which again, we think of a bouquet of flowers, and we don't think of that's just sexual organs, right? But anyway, so if you truly think symmetrically of that pattern of coevolution, things look rather different. It might be the case that they do develop some of these adaptations, but not for us, okay? But sometimes you have to think of who they should care about. For example, caterpillars. You know that caterpillars, some plants can segregate these substances that mess up with the brain of the caterpillar and makes it become cannibal. So the caterpillar, and the munching caterpillar is eating the leaf, then the plant segregates this, then it's converting the caterpillar into a cannibal and eats the other caterpillars. So they eat each other out. So it's two birds with one stone. The one you ate is not going to eat you, and the one that ate the other one is stuffed. So that's pretty amazing. And that's a way in which you might think of those molecules playing a role that matters to them. So we are not meaningful to them. To them, they themselves are meaningful, and whoever is messing around with them, but not us.
And maybe as we're over time, maybe we can take the last three questions at once and have them answered at once. I'm sorry, the guy who's just come up is, I guess, should we do that? So just, yeah, go on, sorry.
Thank you very much for the very provocative talks. I was wondering if you could inform us as to what is known, just in a very basic sense, about the temporal coordination or organization of electrical activity in plants, and whether there is a state-dependent change, for example, even from light to dark.
Oh, sorry. And just the last two questions, and then we can answer them all together?
Right. Well,
Oh, sorry,
I'm
we
sorry.
just get all the questions together.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much for your talks. It was really interesting to see the behavioral psychological experiments done on plants. As far as my understanding goes, conditioning and expectation is something related to memory. Once we eliminate the behavior which can be explained by the memory of the plants, is there something else which suggests this is not about like the biological chemical memory of the plant and it should be coming from a different source like an awareness? That's my question.
Thank you. And then the final question, and the speakers can answer them.
Yes. Again, thank you for amazing talks. Question about why everyone else was unsuccessful prior to Galiano's successful showing of associative learning in plants, and what that can maybe tell us about looking for these kinds of things in other sort of lower organisms like bacteria or even chairs.
Okay.
In response to the second and third questions, the second one, I do think, the question about memory, whether showing this suggests that plants have memory in some sense, and then if you've shown that, does that indicate that they have awareness? I guess in the spirit of the things I was saying a moment ago, I think that I would want to go slow there, not because I don't want to get to that exciting conclusion, but I don't know that for me, it matters so much that it shows that they have awareness, because I think I'm willing to concede already at this point that they clearly have some kind of awareness. They are sensitive to their environment. They display holistic, integrated responses to a wide range of stimuli in ways that we're, I think, probably only beginning to appreciate over the past few decades. So that's where I would be most comfortable. And on the third question, which I'm now just blanking on, why did the original set of associative experiments not work so well? It's for the reason that Professor Calvo suggested, that plants are more sophisticated than we thought 4 or 5 decades ago when the experiments were originally done, so that the controls for the experiments weren't good enough. They just didn't arrange the experiment well enough that they could get those numbers above 50%. They just didn't keep the plants controlled in the proper way. And so he's right that we do need to duplicate the experiments that have just been done by Galiano, but need to get better controls in place for even those experiments so we can be sure about why it's 62% and 69% rather than, say, 90% in either case.
Yeah, thanks. And who was doing the first? Yeah, you were on the synchronicity, right? The spiking. Yeah. This is good because this takes us back to Darwin again. Darwin was the first one to speculate that the brain of the plant might be at the root apex, right? Where is all the coordination is taking place, these patterns of swarming behavior in roots. There is a special part in the root apex called the transition zone. It's just like 100 cells in between the cover, the root cap, and the elongation zone. And these guys there, these 100 cells, well, you have the meristematic cells are being, pumping new cells continuously onto the transition zone. So they're pushing them backwards into elongation, and when they cross that millimeter, we are talking about the ready root tip, they cross into elongation zone, and then they elongate. So if they cross all the cells, if they all cross at the same time, they elongate at the same time, which means you're going to grow in a straight line. If you cross before I do, you elongate first, then I turn this way. And if you do it the other way, so that's the way they do daily this. So you think that if a root, for example, is targeting a nutrient gradient, a source of food, or water, or the maze you saw towards the sound of water, then they've got to orchestrate very precisely who is crossing the border in between transition zone and elongation zone first. You guys go first, I go first. And it's not coincidence that the highest level of synchronous firing takes place in the transition zone cells throughout the whole plant body. So in the whole plant, those guys there are the ones that fire in sync more than the others, right? So that's very promising. But again, a note of caution is that we are far too used in animal subjects to think of action potentials. And plants, of course, they have action potentials. Pretty much the same thing goes on. No? The electrophysiological profile of the three phases is exactly the same. Just change the time scale and the amplitude, but pretty much the same. But they, on top of the action potentials, they have a slow wave potentials, variation potentials. They have systemic potentials. They have, a whole panoply of different electrical firing signatures. So yes, there is synchronicity that we can identify differently throughout the plant body, but we need to unearth all this to understand what it means to have all these electrical jet different signatures and how they all combine together.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speakers for a fascinating discussion.